Hey class, today we are going to take a look at class and ID selectors. Now in the past couple weeks we've been doing CSS, but we've just been doing what's known as type selectors. So we've been targeting all of our H1 elements, or maybe targeting our paragraph elements. But once our sites start to get a little bit more complex, we're going to want to have a little bit more control over what elements we can select with our CSS rules. And this is where class and ID selectors are going to help us a lot. So first off, let's take a look at what a class selector is. So a class selector allows you to create a CSS rule for multiple unrelated elements. So I could give a class attribute to a paragraph, I could give it to a div, I could give it to an image. Pretty much any element I can assign it to be a class. Now we'll go over some code demos in a little bit where I demonstrate this. I know I said in the past I want to not rely on PowerPoints too much, so I'm kind of showing you these slides to set the stage here, but we're going to be going into a code demo very shortly. Now a class selector is going to begin with a period, and as you'll see later on, an ID selector begins with that hashtag or pound sign. And HTML elements are assigned to a class using that class attribute. Once again, an attribute is in our element. It's where we have something like class equals, and then we have those two quotes. So let me pull up my code editor so we can take a look at this. Alright, so I've gone ahead and opened brackets in the left window, and on the right window I have this page rendered over here in Chrome. So as soon as I save it, I'll be able to go here and refresh and see the changes that I've made. You might recognize this page. I started this in the class where I talked about the Project 1 description, and I went over what our portfolio site might look like with the 4 or 5 different sections. So I'm going to continue working on this file and demonstrate how to make a class. In this case, I'm also going to just put my CSS in as an embedded style in the head. Yes, I could, and if I was doing this for my project or homework, I would want to do this in external style sheet. But to keep things a little bit simpler and to prevent me from, or to keep me from having to jump from different files, I'm just going to do all my CSS right here in the head. So let's pretend, for example, I want to change our paragraph to be red. So I want to change where it says lorem ipsum to be red. Now in the past, in previous weeks, we would have done one of these type selectors. We would have selected all of the elements that are of the type paragraph, and I could have said color : red. Now if I save this and I go and refresh, you'll see all the paragraphs have now changed to red. This is what we've done so far, and in most of the cases it is probably okay because we have a very simple site and we want consistency. But let's say, for example, for some reason I want to just change this first paragraph to be red. Well, as you can see here, the problem with this type of rule is that it's affecting every single paragraph. So it's affecting this paragraph, it's affecting this one, and our lower one. This is where a class selector is going to come into our rescue. What I want to do is I want to create a class, and I can call it whatever I want. I'm going to add an attribute, so that would be put inside of these two symbols, and I'm going to say class. I'm going to say equal, and then I'm going to put my two quotes. They can be single or they can be double, and I'm going to call the class whatever I want. This is just sort of defining the name we're going to use later on in our CSS. So we can name it anything we want, but I'd suggest naming it something useful or something that you would remember down the road. In this case I could name it something like red, but that might not be the best name because maybe it's going to be red, bigger font, and bold. So red might be too generic of a name. Maybe I want to call it something like first paragraph. Maybe I have like a newspaper or something and I want to highlight that first paragraph. So I'll call it first para for short. So we've now defined our class equals first para. This is the first step. The second step will now be to go to our CSS rules, whether it be embedded or an external one, and we now need to create our rule. Now before I actually add my selector, you'll remember when we created a rule, we have our two curly brackets, and inside of here we have that property value pair. So I'm going to say color equals red. But now we need to define what element we're targeting. Instead of just targeting an individual P in this case, we are now going to target the first para. So now that I've gone ahead and I've declared my rule up here, and it matches here, this is going to be case sensitive, so I've made it all lowercase, and I suggest just making your rules all lowercase too. They would work if they're uppercase, but once again they're case sensitive. So just to save yourself the risk of making these errors, let's just always use lowercase. If you wanted to, you could, use dashes or underscores, something like that, if you wanted to set up a naming convention like that. But I'm going to go ahead and save here, and if all goes as planned, you'll see that this first paragraph has now changed to be red. So we've now accomplished what I needed to accomplish. Now the nice thing about classes is that they're going to be reusable. We don't want to repeat ourselves and write a lot of code multiple times. Whereas we'll see later on, we can only use an ID once. It's a unique identification. Whereas a class we can use as many times as we want. So let's say for some reason I wanted to make this first paragraph red, and I also wanted to make this third paragraph red. Well, what I could do is I could copy this attribute. I'm just going to do copy and paste to minimize the chances of me misspelling it, but it's perfectly fine to rewrite it. I'm going to go to my third paragraph, and I'm going to paste that in here. I'm going to go ahead and save, click refresh, and now you'll see our first and our third paragraph are now red. Next, let's take a look at doing an ID selector. Now, an ID we're going to declare just like we've declared our class here. In this case, we've did ID equals education. And we did this when we looked at how to build Project 1. So if you've already done Project 1, you're hopefully familiar with this if you're kind of far along with it. But you'll recall we gave this education section an ID of education. This enabled me to be able to click it and get brought down to this section. So we've already defined this ID here, and once again an ID you only want to use one time. So you saw up here I was able to take this class of first para, I was able to assign it here, and I was able to assign it here. An ID, you don't want to do that. You could technically get away with it, but then you'll get a validation error and you'll lose points. And it would cause problems if you're trying to anchor your navigation to it. So let's go ahead and target this ID, and let's go ahead and make this education H2 blue. Once again, we don't want to target every single H2 header. By doing this, we would target everyone. If I did color equals blue, let's save it and refresh, you'll see that changes everything. That's a type selector. Now instead we just want to target this individual piece called education. Now here's the thing you need to remember that's different between class and ID. So this is the important thing you need to take away from this lecture. With our class, we put a dot in front of the name, so we did dot first para. With an ID, we're going to use that pound or hashtag symbol. We're going to put that in front of our education. If we put a dot in front of it, it's not going to work. We need to do this pound since it's an ID and not a class. So let's go ahead and save that and refresh, and now you'll see this education is blue, but this H2 down here called other personal with a different ID is still the default color of black. I just jumped back to our PowerPoint presentation, and these slides are online in this week's material. This is pointing out, this is a reference slide. You're not expected to memorize this slide, but I want to point out that basically any element inside of your HTML, no matter how nested or buried, there's a good chance you'll be able to select it in some way and create rules for it. They can get very complicated. When I first started teaching this class, I kind of made the mistake of going through each one of these, and it took a long time, and it was very confusing. What I would recommend doing is you kind of want to look up these elements as needed, in my opinion. I'll show you a couple of basic ones that I think are used a lot. You'll want to use this descendant selector a lot. You might use this multi-element selector a lot. Whereas these other ones I would say are more used in special cases. You want to know they exist, but it's a lot to throw at you when you've just started doing this web development. So let's just take a look at this everything selector. This might be useful in some cases if you want to essentially override some of the default browser styles. So this, if you simply do the star and then you do your opening curly bracket and your closing curly bracket, you could put your rules in here and it would affect all the browser's default styles. Now let's take a look at this element selector, the multi-element selector. This one I think is actually pretty useful because you could use it to style more than one element. And I could see you doing this a lot with headers. Let's imagine we're building a site and we have headers. We have several levels of headers we're using. We don't necessarily want to change the font size. We like the fact that by default our H1 is maybe 25 pixels, our H2 is 20 pixels, our H3 is 18, something like that. But we have a nice color scheme of, let's say, blue and yellow on our website. So we want to change all of our headers to have a color of navy in this case. As opposed to having to do H1 color navy, then doing a second rule H2 color navy, we can kind of use this shortcut and we put a comma in between each element to indicate that this element has ended and now we're declaring another element, but we're going to assign the same rule to all of these elements. So this one I'd probably recommend you memorize and use when you can. Now things get a little bit more complicated. As you can see, as I pointed out in that previous slide, you can use the space for a descendant selector. You can use this for a child selector. So a child in your relationship of HTML, if you have a div and then inside that div you have a P element, that P is going to be a child of that div in a sense. You also have these adjacent and general sibling selectors. Now I'm not going to demo every single one as I mentioned just because that gets a little out of hand, but I do want to go ahead and demo this descendant selector because this is going to be a really important one, I believe. So I'm going to go jump into our code demo one more time. I'm back in brackets and Chrome, and let's take a look at this descendant selector. And as it sounds, you're targeting something that's a descendant of another class. This is going to be helpful, I think, when you have things like unordered lists. So for example, let's create a simple unordered list underneath our education site. So maybe in our portfolio we have an unordered list of classes that we took at RIT. So let's just say web and mobile 1. And then let's say maybe we have another list underneath other personal of our hobbies. Now let's save this and refresh, and now you'll see we have an unordered list here and an unordered list here. Now let's suppose that we want to go ahead and we want to change this unordered list, but we don't want to change this one. And I see people struggling with this when they first start doing web development. what they'll try to do, once again, is they'll create a descendant selector like this, and they'll say color equals green, and then it will affect both of these. And it starts off being okay. They don't realize it's a problem, but then they suddenly go and add another list that they don't want to have green, and now all of a sudden they have a problem they don't know how to fix. Now, I did just show you kind of another way to fix this. Yes, we could give this one a class. Let's say we wanted it to be red. We could actually reuse this first paragraph class, and we could do this and refresh, and you'll notice that now this is red because we've given it the class of first para, and this has remained green. But you can kind of make the argument that having to add a class to every single element on your page can be a bit time consuming, and it kind of makes your code perhaps a bit more bloated. What if there were a way to make this the color we want without having to create yet another class attribute? And the hint here, yes, there is going to be another way. We know, for example, that we want to target the UL, the unordered list, that's inside of a certain section of our site. So let's go ahead and create a section for our education, area. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give this a class of education. And we can actually get away with this because we've done an ID here, and we've done a class here, but let's just call it education-section, just so we know. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to put this whole section inside of this div. Now, since we have such a simple site, you're probably asking yourself, well, what's the point of doing this? And you're right, in a site that looks this simple, there isn't. But as you start building up your sites more, you're going to want to create rules for different sections. And it's a lot easier when you go ahead and create these sections when you're first building your HTML. Then you can go and add your rules later on. It's sometimes a little hard when you have to go back and forth, I found. It's nice when you start getting really good at HTML, you'll just set up some of the structure when you set it up initially. So now we see that this education H2 is kind of a descendant of this education section. So what we could do is we could target this H2 inside of this div with a class of education section. Well, how do we do that? Let's play around with this. We're going to go up to our CSS, and what we could do is, yes, we actually I wanted to target the UL. I apologize for that. I didn't want to target this. I want to target the UL. So right now we have a UL that's targeting all unordered lists. So I'm going to refresh here, and once again you'll see both of our unordered lists are green because of this rule. But how do we make this rule apply to only this first UL? What we want to say is that I want this rule to only apply to unordered lists inside of this education section. And I can do that by simply saying education, if I spell it right, education-section space UL. Now I'm still missing something. Hopefully, if you guys are thinking along, what am I missing here? I'm missing that dot or hashtag. Since this is a class, I need to use the dot. So now this is saying any UL inside of this education section will become green. This URL hopefully will not become green. It will stay black because it is not in a class called education section. So let's go ahead, save it, and refresh, and sure enough you'll see this one is green and this one is black. So it's a very simple concept, but I know it confuses people a lot, but I hope it's something that you guys can grasp pretty early on because it's going to be really powerful for building your sites. Jumping back to the slides really quick here, we're just about finished. You'll see at slide 12, it goes over what these child selectors do, and I would go through these, maybe just review the PowerPoint PDF on your own, and you'll see up here we have the code, and down below we have the CSS, and this is going to be the result. So this will kind of show you what this element's going to do. This will show you what the next element selector will do, and so on. Like I said, I've gotten into trouble, I feel like, the time I've spent actually showing these all off, because it takes a long time, and it's kind of a lot to throw at you when we've just learned class and ID. But go ahead and go through these, and you can kind of get an idea of what these work. They can also get very complicated too, in the sense, if you've ever done programming and you're trying to compare two strings, you might have recall using a function called substring. So you can even do that in CSS. You could target attributes that have a specific pattern inside their class or ID, for example. So it can get very complex. There's a ton of information, once again, at the W3 Schools on this that will walk you through each of those selectors. And finally, I want to point out, for if you haven't already, just like when you validated your HTML, you're also going to be required to validate your CSS for this course. It's a very similar process to validating HTML. You're going to go to this website, and you can simply paste in your CSS. This is going to tell you if you have anything wrong. And I might put another video separately on validating your CSS. Finally, these are just a couple of sites that you might want to take a look at. The CSS Zen Garden is kind of a neat thing. Basically, it's a lot of designs that are made purely with CSS. They all have the base HTML, but they've used pure CSS to make sites that look radically different. So take a look at that if you'd like to get a little inspiration. That's all I have for this week. Please keep working on your projects, and tune in next week where we will continue on.